All right, so here we are on lesson 7.3a, where we are talking about the discriminant. So make sure that you add discriminant to your table of contents in your notebook. And then remember that anytime we go through this video, that you need to pause it. Just pause it if you need to continue to write something down and I didn't give you enough time. If you need to go back and listen to something a second time, feel free to do that as well. This is your learning, so it is up to you. So we're going to be talking about the discriminant today, okay? And the discriminant is a piece of the quadratic formula that we are going to be talking about in the next few days. And the quadratic formula is how we find the zeros to a function. And if you remember, the zeros are in a parabola here, which is a U-shaped figure. The zeros are anywhere that it crosses the x-axis, and in a quadratic function, we have 2 in most cases. There are also times where we will have only 1, because it sits right on the x-axis, and there are also times where we will have none, because it doesn't touch the x-axis at all, okay? And we can tell just by looking at the equation without a graph that whether it will have 2, 1, or no zeros by using the discriminant, okay? So I'm going to give you a preview of the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula says x equals, because we're trying to find the x-intercepts, and it's a pretty big formula, negative b plus or minus the square root, remember how I said the other day square roots were going to come into play, of b squared minus 4ac. All of those are multiplying, and it's all over 2a. Okay? So that's your quadratic formula. Now the discriminant is just a piece of that, okay? Specifically, it's going to be this piece inside the radical sign. So the discriminant is just b squared minus 4ac. Now I know all of those letters probably don't mean a whole lot to you right now, but they will in a second. And by finding this value right here, it'll come out to be a number. We can then determine the number of solutions once we have evaluated that. And remember, the term evaluating means we're going to be substituting. Okay? So when we're given an equation, we're going to be substituting into this discriminant to get a value, and that value will tell us what our picture will look like. Okay? So let's look at example 1. So find example 1 with me. And the first thing you need to do is make sure that your function is in standard form and that it equals 0. So this one obviously equals 0. And we have the x squared followed by the x and then the constant. So all of that is in standard form. Then we have a, b, and c. So in this function, we know that a equals 1 because that's the coefficient here. B will equal negative 4, and c will equal 3. So if I'm going to use that formula, b squared minus 4ac, I like to put parentheses around these guys to remind me that they are multiplying. Okay, so now we have b squared minus 4 times a times c, and so I'm going to plug in my b of negative 4 here. I'm going to plug in my a of 1 and my c of 3. And then we just have to evaluate it. So when you're looking at this, negative 4 squared means negative 4 times negative 4, and a negative times a negative is a positive 16. Okay? Then, if I use a state change, I have a negative 4 times 1 is negative 4 times 3 is negative 12. Okay? That gives me a discriminant of 4. Now, what I've also done is I have graphed that function, and I want you to notice this number and the function. If you look at this function, how many intercepts does it have? It has 2. So there are 2 zeros. What do you notice about this number? Is this number positive or negative? This is a positive. So I want you to make a note that a positive discriminant has 2 zeros. So it doesn't matter what your discriminant comes out to, as long as it is positive. That means we're going to have 2 zeros, or 2, sometimes you'll see the word solution, and then we know that both of those words mean that there are 2 intercepts. So if you had a discriminant of 10, you would still have just 2 intercepts. If you had a discriminant of 100, it happens sometimes, you will still just have 2 intercepts. We have 3 choices when you're talking about a quadratic: 2, 1, or none. And so if your discriminant is positive, you will have 2. So let's look at example 2. Okay, now if you look at the related graph, you'll notice then how many do we have? We have 1. Okay, so let's see what our discriminant looks like when we have just 1 0. Okay, so again, we have to check that it's in standard form. We have x squared followed by the x followed by the constant, and it equals 0. So that means we have a, b, and c. So our a will equal 1, our b is going to equal 2, and our c is going to equal 1. So we're going to plug it in again. B squared minus 4ac. Okay, so when I plug this in, I'm going to have 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times 1. Well, this ends up being 4 minus 4, which equals what? It equals 0. So this is where things get a little confusing. A lot of people think when your discriminant becomes 0 that they have 0 solution. But that's not true. We know from our lesson on solving quadratics using square roots that it's when you take a square root of a negative that you're going to get no solution. So now we just have 0. 0 isn't negative. You could technically take the square root of 0, right? Square root of 0 is just 0. So this is when we have 1 solution. And you'll understand more when we do the quadratic formula why this happens. Why is there only 1 solution? And it has to do with the square root portion and how the square root of 0 is 0. But for now, all you need to know is that if the discriminant is 0, you only have 1 solution. Okay? So make a note of that. You have 1 solution if the discriminant is 0, and that's what your picture would look like. That whole, your vertex right there, we talked about vertex, right? Okay, your vertex is on the x-axis, and that's because your discriminant is 0. Okay? And so our last piece is example 3, and so this is that one, if you look at our graph down here, where it doesn't touch our x-axis at all. So we have no solutions. And let's look at what you could probably guess, but let's look at how it turns out real quick. So again, check that it's in standard form. And then we have our a, b, and c. So a is that coefficient of 1. B is -2, and c is a +2. We have b squared minus 4ac. So I'm going to have, now be careful here, a -2 squared minus 4 times 1 times 2. I'm just taking my values and plugging them in, right? So the -2 squared is 4. 4 times 1 is 4 times 2 is 8, so -8. So I end up with a -4. And so think about, if you saw in that quadratic formula, it's b squared, I'm sorry, not b squared, negative b is our quadratic formula, right? Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. Now, this is our discriminant. And so when you're plugging in to that quadratic formula, your discriminant is going to be inside the square root. That means that in that square root, we're going to have the square root of a negative. And what happens when you take the square root of a negative? You get no solution. So, if the discriminant is negative, then you have discriminant is negative, you have no solution. Sorry. So, just real quick to recap. If we have a negative discriminant, that b squared minus 4ac is negative, then there's no solution. Your picture would look like this. Okay? If it comes out to be 0, you have one solution. And if it comes out to be a positive number, you have 2. Remember that zeros and solutions are the same thing. So when I say one solution, that means 1, 0. Okay? And when I say no solution, that means there are no zeros. Okay? All of that means the same thing. So you're going to see some questions come up where they're going to give you a graph. Let's say your graph looks like this. And they're going to say, what are some possible discriminants? And they might list something like 5, 2, 0, -3, and -7. Well, you can tell right here that I have no zeros. So if I think about no zeros, that means my discriminant has to be negative. So then I can look at my negative answers, and these could be my possible discriminants. So just keep that in mind. Like, you have to use this knowledge that we just went through in our notes to answer some different types of questions. They might also just ask you, would this have a positive, negative, or 0 discriminant? So be mindful of all of that. Okay? So you should be able to scroll down in Canvas and see your next set of directions. There's usually some practice questions. So go ahead and do those, and then we'll move on with our activities tomorrow.